for tuning into our presentation screencast. The topic of our research project was creative writing in relation to student attitudes, effects on student engagement, content understanding, and interpersonal relationships. The purpose of our project was to investigate the impacts that implementing creative writing tasks can have in an ELA classroom in relation to student engagement and attitudes, teacher-student relationships, and various other factors in the high school setting. In terms of the rationale for our project, we chose to undertake this research plan in an attempt to explore creative writing as a mode of increasing student engagement and enriching and deepening content understanding within English language classrooms. We also chose to choose a research topic that was something that we could all easily implement into our classrooms as English teachers. And we also found that all of us have our own passions for creative writing and wanted to provide students with the opportunity to explore this discipline while also gathering insight in the interest of our future students.
In order to guide our research, our group came up with one research question. Our question is, what features of creative writing assignments and instruction lead to increased student engagement in English language arts classrooms? Some of the research and theory that we drew from to inform our project falls into the following four categories. The first one is creative writing's effects on self-directed learning. So we used a definition of self-directed learning from Brockett and Heemster in 1991. They defined self-directed learning as both the external characteristics of an instructional process and the internal characteristics of the learner, where the individual assumes primary responsibility for a learning experience. And then we also drew from the work of three other studies. So we have Mungun's 2012, Dali et al. 2015, and Nino and Pai's 2018. And all of these authors looked at some work on how creative writing impacts self-directed learning, either through student voice, student ownership, or creative writing as a language learning tool. Our next theme was the effects of creative writing instruction on academic achievement. So Babaye-Git 2019 looked at an increase in language aptitude, and then Snell 2018 looked at increased academic success. Our third subheading was effects on motivation. So we have Avila 2015, Babaye-Git 2018, Lowe and Highland 2007. All three of these studies looked at how the development and creation of students' unique identities as writers positively impacts students' motivation. And then, as you can see, they each go into slightly different subtopics: liberty of expression, communication and self-expression, and confidence building as a result of exposure to creative writing activities. Our next subheading was features of creative writing assignments designed for student engagement. So Holiday 1978 looked at texts as products of social conditions. Ryan 2014 discussed connectedness to subject matter, and Nino and Pais 2018 discussed improvement of language skills and self-expression. So all of these are in the context of how creative writing assignments promote student engagement.
Alrighty, so moving on to methodology, I'm going to discuss the data that we collected and how we analyzed it. So as noted prior, this is happening across 4 different classrooms. Maggie, Angelica, and myself are at Summit Shasta in Daly City, and then Nicole is down at Denali, which is in Sunnyvale. Maggie has freshmen, Nicolette has juniors, and Angelica and myself both have seniors. I think it is important to note that despite the fact that Angelica and I are both teaching AP Lit at Summit Shasta, we have completely separate classes. We actually teach in different classroom spaces. So even though you might think that they're very similar in a lot of ways, they are 2 completely different groups of students, completely led by each of us individually. With that, there were 2 inquiry cycles that we collected data with. This was not our initial designated amount of time, but with Summit Shasta's 2 weeks of expeditions right next to spring break, we had to kind of just go with the flow, and so we ended up just having 2 consecutive weeks of inquiry cycles. In terms of collecting the data, there are a number of different methods that we used. The first one were surveys that we administered to our students. We had this survey take place before any sort of data collection, before the creative writing prompts. It was the very first thing that we did. These surveys were the same across all 4 classes. We crafted the questions together, and we also had the students take a survey after the data collection. There were a few questions that were present on both the pre and the post surveys, and then some are specific to either or. These will be some things that we covered during the findings section, and I'll also go over one to analyze as well. Another way that we collected data were with the field notes. This, of course, was done individually since we were not in each other's classrooms, but we observed our students as they were going through the creative writing prompts and then just took notes. And our final piece of data collection that was seen throughout all 4 of our classrooms were, of course, the actual creative writing free writes. These were written by each one of us for our classroom. And the main thing that we wanted to do with these were to make sure that they aligned with the content of our day. So for example, in my class, we were reading The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde. The way that the classes were structured were we opened with the creative writing prompt. We had 45 minutes of me lecturing to the students. Then we had a Socratic seminar after that. The Socratic seminar content matched that of which I was lecturing with, so I was sure that I had the prompt match the same sort of thing that I was teaching and the students would be talking about. One specific example would be the students were having a Socratic seminar based on the 100 or so pages that they had to read for that day. With that, I had a lecture that was based on content from that time. And so I had to create a question that went with the content of all of that. So one day the students were reading about an interaction between the main character and a mongoose, a supernatural event. The lecture for that day was about supernatural folklore in the Dominican Republic culture. And so the example question that I had was as follows. Thinking back to Belly's interaction with the mongoose, write a similar interaction, as weird as you would like it to be, where you are cast as the main character. You should focus on the element of mysticism and their interaction between you and some sort of supernatural or otherworldly being. So, point of this all being, we were very mindful of making sure that our questions aligned with the content for the day. In terms of analyzing, because we had the different classes, we obviously had different prompts and we had different field notes. That was obviously something that we then had to look at qualitatively, since we couldn't really uniformly address these things. Whereas opposed to the surveys that were administered to all the students the same, we could look at these individually within our own classes, then also compare them holistically with one another. As I said, Nicole is going to go through the findings for this, but I just want to quickly walk through how we analyzed some of our survey results. So you can see that we have a question. Do you think that creative writing activities have a connection to academic success? With that, you have the results from the pre-survey before any sort of creative writing prompts were given, and then the results from the post-survey. So just looking at this information, you can see that the negative feelings went up 3%, the positive feelings went up 7%, and then the neutral feelings actually went down. With that, we also compared our data with one another. So you have all these numbers staring at you right now, but you can just see how each class compared all in response to this question. This is super useful to analyze our data holistically to see how we all did, then of course to see, oh, my class had this feeling. How does that compare to Angelica's? Oh wow, Maggie's class really dropped in neutrality, etc., etc.
The messiness of our action research project. There were a few limitations that came with our study, one of them being that the data that we were able to collect was limited. The inquiry cycles in which we collected the data were over the span of 2 consecutive weeks, which obviously is not a long period of time. So the progress that was reflected in our findings and research was not representative of a whole semester or a whole year. Furthermore, there was a bit of lack of consistency in the data collection due to frequent student absences. Because of the fact that some students were absent on the days that we conducted the surveys and the creative writing activities, we ended up having varying participants in both the activities and surveys. Furthermore, there were some general scheduling conflicts due to varied school schedules. Summit Shasta was on spring break and also had expeditions in April, and so that left us with only about 4 instructional days to implement our research, which led us to deciding to conduct the majority of our research in March. So we were working with a bit of a time crunch. Nicole also had a different schedule at Denali, and she conducted her inquiry cycles after the cycles that were conducted in the 3 classrooms at Shasta. Lastly, because of the nature of Summit, our curriculum is pretty preset in the platform, and so it was really up to each researcher's discretion how to tailor the writing activities to best fit the existing curriculum and plans that we were already working with. Moving on to some of the challenges to viewpoints, knowledge, and biases. It's possible that there were some unintended biases that may have come with researchers' positionalities. All of us come from different places, and as teachers, we are always bringing our own values and perspectives with us, and this filters into what is prioritized in the classroom and the observations that we make, because we're all driven by our own motivations and teacher philosophies. So biases could exist in an unintended way within our research. However, we did do our best to address our positionalities and critically think about how this may affect the nature of our research observations and findings. Secondly, there were some varying levels and inconsistencies that can be assumed in the levels of student self-awareness. The research participants spanned over 9th, 11th, and 12th grade classes, and so on an individual basis, students, like any other individuals, all have varying levels of self-awareness, and so this could affect the way that students were responding to the questions on post-surveys that asked them to self-assess their levels of engagement and content understanding, because students who are at a younger age or might be at earlier developmental stages may not be at the same level of self-awareness as, for example, a 17 or 18-year-old senior. And so this is also something that we needed to acknowledge could be a challenge to our knowledge. So many of those students who answered with neutral on some of the questions on our surveys may just not have that level of self-awareness to assess their own engagement, or may not have really critically thought about the questions. However, obviously these are all educated guesses. Furthermore, there was a lack of consistent definition amongst us on what creative writing and engagement and terms like that really mean. And so, as researchers, we did not discuss a common definition for these terms, and therefore they can be pretty subjective. And so, students were not provided with a common definition for what creative writing is, which could have also affected the way that they answered the survey questions, because creative writing could mean something different to each person. Some of the alterations that we made to our plans to address some of this messiness were that some of us became a bit more intentional with our creative writing prompts. For example, Eric decided to change his prompts in order for them to be more connected to students and their own experiences and identities, rather than having the prompts be primarily based on the text. Furthermore, we added additional questions to the post survey in order to have a means to measure the changes pre and prior to the inquiry cycles in the student attitudes and effects on engagement and content understanding over time. Lastly, we decided to kind of collectively zoom in on engagement for field notes. We noticed, each of us to some degree noticed discrepancies in how students were engaging with the writing prompts. So, for example, some students would easily transition into writing, whereas some needed a lot more prompting and guidance. And so this is something that we decided to kind of track and look for over time to see what types of trends might have risen.
So moving into findings, we have divided up our findings section into 4 defined segments for your viewing pleasure. Our first section is the student attitudes continued. Next is student engagement, teacher-student relationships, and other, which is consisting of an outlier variable study conducted at Denali High School. So, as Eric kindly explained, some key findings in our research regarding student attitudes in the methodology analysis earlier. I'm going to be building off that data, and our research is focused on student attitudes. I'd like to introduce the remainder of our findings regarding student attitude shifts as illuminated by our post-survey data. So we asked the following question: do you think free writes we've done for the past couple weeks have been worthwhile in our post-survey of the study? And we noticed a couple things. So the trends were that very few students did not think the creative writing exercises were worthwhile. 11th and 9th grade both reported 25 neutral votes, and the positive compounded student attitude responses across the classes were all above 50%, with the exception of Eric's group, of whom only 27% responded positively. The compounded positive responses are as follows. Angelica's class responded yes to the following question, or positively to the following question, about 50%. Eric's 27%. My class responded yes 75%, and Maggie's 58%. Overall, we're seeing a strong majority of student attitudes showing an understanding of the merit of the creative writing exercises in class, and a minority, under 20%, across all groups of students with negative attitude responses to the exercises. So, next I'd like to introduce the findings from our questions that measured about student engagement. We asked the question, do you think the free writes have deepened your engagement in class / with our unit? And the following responses are, I think, quite interesting. The trend is that 30% of students across the classes did not experience increased engagement, and my class was an outlier in this data set. The majority of Shasta students responded extremely similarly, as you can see in the no column, with Angelica, Eric, and Maggie's responses all hovering around 30%, not yes or no, so our neutral section around the 40% line, and then we move on into the yeses, which do vary a little bit, but I did think that the no and neutral response similarity was pretty interesting. So next, we wanted to move into our findings about teacher-student relationships. We are going to introduce these by individual researcher first, since they did vary and the responses were slightly lengthy. So first we have Angelica. So she noticed that through the creative writing exercises, opportunities were provided to learn more personal aspects of her student identities, values, and cultures. And she specifically noticed that students were more comfortable engaging in casual dialogue, both academic and non-academic, with her. Moving on, we have Eric's observations. He clearly identified an increase in quantity of student interactions outside of class. There was a very clear spike in this habit after the creative writing exercises. So he really noticed a stark response after this research. Next, my findings in the student-teacher relationship section of this study were that students began approaching me outside of class as well, as the other two researchers have noted, and approximately 67% of these interactions outside of class were initiated by the students first. They had begun asking questions like, "How is your day going?" or enthusiastically greeting me, which had differed from their responses in the past when they had initiated interactions with like "it was fine" or like "hey" or a nod. Now there are far more detailed stories about their weekends, about their identities, and about specific instances that they had mentioned in their creative writing exercises. Moving on, we have Maggie. She responded very similarly to Angelica. I'm sure you can see our trends beginning to develop here. She had learned more about student beliefs, concerns, and priorities. As you can see, there are two examples underneath her little note here. So one student was very concerned about the economy and the state of the job market. Another student was highly concerned about higher education, college admissions, etc. So she was leveraging the opportunity to really kind of dig deep and see what not only the thought process of her students was, but how they were prioritizing what they were concerned about. So these trends, as you can, I'm sure, see already, the increased interactions with students in quality through the creative writing exercises during lessons and outside of classes had increased, as well as the positive personal interactions recorded by the researchers increased over the course of the study, showing a higher quantity of positive relationship building trends. So over the course of this amazing research, we have seen just incredible things from our students, and I think not only the classroom culture, but our teacher-student relationships with our students has highly increased. So moving on to the other section, this is pertaining to creative writing's connection to academic achievement. We have all of our researchers' responses here. As you can see, our trends were that these responses were extremely similar to the engagement ones from the post-survey responses from our students. In fact, they're nearly identical, with the exception of Angelica's students responding more indifferently rather than negatively, and Maggie's students switched from more indifferent responses to an increase in content understanding. So hers shifted to more yes and absolutely votes. So we saw a positive increase in student responses towards understanding the content. Next, we have a Denali-specific sort of data set here. So Denali's 11th grade class increased academic performance after the creative writing exercises. I tracked the increase in students submitting homework on time, which had previously been a struggle for the class. Typically, in previous units, there was an average of about 30% of students turning in homework or checkpoints or final products on time. There has now been a 45% increase for this project, which I find very encouraging. Following that, we saw that students exhibited increased academic achievement through meeting passing scores in content assessments and homework assignments. The class at the beginning of this study had 20% of students not yet passing with grades of C or lower. And now at the end of this study, 100% of the class has passing grades of a C or higher. So I thought that was really interesting and extremely encouraging. So moving on to reflections, I'll hand it over.
Thanks, Nicole. So now let's wrap things up with some reflections. I tried to look at all of our... No, I need to start over. Okay. Thanks, Nicole. Now let's wrap things up with some reflections. As a whole, there were a few different things that we all agreed on when we were looking back on this action research project. The first and probably the most obvious one is that teaching is a process of continuous self-improvement. Hindsight is 20/20. There are a number of different instances throughout this project that we all kind of collectively said, oh, we should have done this, or would have been so much better if we would have done that. That's obviously true in our regular lessons, so it should come as no surprise that it was really seen here. Another thing that we all came up with is the idea that action research projects can be an extremely beneficial and challenging undertaking. As we went through Nicole's findings, we really learned a lot about our students and about the way that we exist within the classroom. So even though at times we may have been challenged by the process, at the end we're all very happy to have gone through it and certainly see the benefits that we reaped from it. One final reflection that we settled on was that for action research to be meaningful, both the subject and research question must directly address an area of growth in the classroom. Obviously, if you're going through all of this trouble and all of this research and documenting everything, you really need to be looking out for the betterment of your students in an area of growth in the classroom. Otherwise, there's really no point in doing action research to begin with. In terms of the remaining questions that we had, having gone through the process, there were a few. First, how could there have been greater consistency amongst the researchers? I think the point has been nailed home that there were a lot of differences that exist between our classrooms, whether it be school site, age group, many other factors. With that, we wondered, how could we have found greater consistency with our results, accepting these differences? Then moving on kind of to the smaller scale of things, how could we have found fewer limitations and messiness within our own classrooms? Because a number of us started our classes with Block 1, there were definitely some issues with attendance, students coming in late, students really coming in the middle of a creative writing prompt, and it's that question of, well, do you have the student just complete it super quickly, or is this data now skewed because they didn't have the full experience? There definitely was a lot of messiness that went in this, but I think we can all, acknowledge the fact that this is our first little leap into action research, so there should be some forgiveness with that. Additionally, we wondered how could student engagement with creative responses compare to student engagement with expository writing. We obviously really only focused on creative writing as that was at the core of our action research project here, but it was interesting to think about how things would have compared had we also done some sort of expository writing. And finally, to what extent could younger grade level ELA classes benefit from the incorporation of creative writing exercises into their curriculums? As we said, we had all high school students, 9th graders, 11th graders, and 12th graders. But a curiosity that we had was, to what effect could younger students benefit from creative writing? How young is too young when trying to incorporate this into their curriculum? So with that said, thanks for listening, and we hope you enjoyed our presentation and learned a lot. Thank you.